Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, I'm Mike Springman, and I'm an attorney, author, political commentator, and former diplomat.
Now, what exactly are you an author of, and what exactly political commentary? I mean, is that just, watching the news and then commenting on it, or do you go to an actual platform?
Well, my books are Visas for Al Qaeda, CIA handouts that rock the world, and Goodbye Europe, ? Hello Chaos, ? Merkel's migrant bomb. The first book is essentially about my experience being in at the beginning when the United States created Islamic terrorism. And the second book is a kind of a follow-on that talks about the United States forever war in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and I guess South Asia to some extent too, or Central Asia. And driving people out of their countries, Syria, Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, and so forth. And the idea is that you destroy a country by removing the doctors, lawyers, and the equivalent of Indian chiefs and pack them out of the country, moving them to another place, another country, another continent, and creating all kinds of disruption there. So these are available in paperback and from Amazon, and also as ebooks from Amazon. I do writing for Substack. It's Hausfrau Weeks on Substack, and I wrote commentary on the 100 Years' War the United States has been running against first the Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation, going back to Woodrow Wilson when he landed 13,000 American soldiers in what was becoming the Soviet Union in 1918. Written other articles on American Indians, written about the Second Amendment. I've written about Hope Clooney, who was an activist and a progressive when she wants to be, but she supports Israel and opposes Palestine, for example. As far as other commentary goes, I get calls from time to time from Al Mayadeen, which is a radio station in Beirut, generally as part of a panel discussing everything from Israel to Lebanon's economy to a whole variety of issues that are of interest both to the Middle East and to other people around the world. I get calls from Russian television stations to do interviews with them. Generally, though, the last one I did was about Donald Trump and will he go to jail or not, kind of thing. I had been a regular on Press TV, the Iranian news service, and they sort of dropped me, and I'm not quite sure why, but that was kind of demanding. They called me 3 times a day, 7 days a week. And I learned an awful lot about the world through some of the questions and some of the programs I was on. In the past, let's see, what else have I been on? I occasionally...
Well, I was about to say, well, how'd you get interested in studying foreign affairs or just looking into, foreign events in general? I mean, that's not a necessarily normal thing for an American citizen. We tend to focus on a lot of problems here. We like to think we're like the only one, and not obviously everyone thinks like, oh, other people are nice from other countries, but only when they come here. It's like we don't know what goes on kind of overseas. We're kind of more secular in our position here. But how'd you get started into overseas affairs?
Well, it goes back to when I was in high school. I had read Letter and Burdick's book, The Ugly American, which was a savage attack on the State Department and how the Foreign Service officers charged with conducting and formulating American foreign policy really hadn't a clue as to what was really going on in the countries to which they were assigned. and really had all kinds of problems relating to American interests and foreign countries' interests, and being unable to reconcile the two in some fashion or understand them in any way. And then I went to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, which at the time was the only undergraduate program in the country for international affairs. It was founded by a Father Walsh of the Jesuits right after the end of the peace conference in the 1914 war, the First World War. And he thought that we really lacked a group of professional diplomats like other countries had. And so he started this Foreign Service School, which the idea was to feed people into the State Department who had some grasp of foreign affairs to begin with. In my case, I could never get in, and I kept failing the oral exam. And eventually, I finally got in, and they threw me out.
Why?
Well, they never told me. I have filed 2 Freedom of Information Act requests. I have barraged them with letters and so forth. And basically, the first Freedom of Information Act lawsuit I did on my own before I became an attorney, they said, we're going to seal this as a threat to national security. And then they simply dismissed the case.
I hate that word so much. You don't know how many times I've come across this national security. I'm like, what? What is it? It makes you guys look bad. Like, that's to me is like the only thing I'm starting to pick up out of all this.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, real national security is keeping secret how to make an atomic bomb in your basement through materials commonly found in your kitchen, or maybe troop movements in time of war. But generally, national security is a good cover for murder, war crimes, and human rights violations, as well as corruption, mismanagement, and abuse of authority. And this is going on really since the end of the Second World War. I was told by a guy at the State Department, Frank Schmelzer, who's dead now. He retired from state and got a job working there part-time as a declassifying officer. And he said they had stuff going back to the First World War that was still classified that didn't need to be, but they were still sitting on it. So by and large, what's classified really shouldn't be classified, and most stuff is overclassified. When I was at the consulate in Stuttgart, the consul general, Doug Jones, wanted me to classify all my reporting so that congressmen couldn't read it and make trouble for the State Department and what it was doing. Or
Now,
not.
is that an active tactic? Like when they have a lawyer, like if they read a brief or something like that? I noticed that a lot of stuff's like in legal speak, and it's like if you're the general public, you're gonna get tripped up on like the first couple of sentences. Like there's sometimes I have to reread it over and over again. Like it's like winning a court case. When you get the letter that tells you, "Hey, you won this court case" or whatever, you're like, "But did I win?" It doesn't sound like it. Usually they say like you won on it or something, but this is like you could, but could not, but could be, but could not. And you're like, well, hang on a second.
Sure. The whole thing is that they have exceptions. I guess about a half a dozen, or maybe in the case of my second Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, 7, the non-existence of documents. The
Destroyed them.
second lawsuit I had filed, I wanted what I should have asked, I guess, in the first one, copies of all of the visas that I had refused at the CIA's consulate in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia on the West Coast. I would deny someone and write down my reasons for the denial on the sheet of paper that they had handed in, giving their name, address, where they were going in the United States, why they were going to the United States, and so forth. And I would interview them for a couple of minutes, and then I would say, yes, you have the visa, and I'd write the reason why, and no, you won't get a visa, and I would write the reason why. And when I was overruled by the Consul General, Jay Freres, repeatedly, I would write this down and say this was overturned by J. Philip Freres, American Consul General, and it would say that it was national security, or he was a good help to the consulate, or whatever the reason Freres gave, if he gave any at all. And I asked for these, and they said, "Oh, we shredded them. We shred these documents every year." Well, when I was in Jeddah, we had a file room filled with 5-drawer filing cases that were filled to overflowing with documents, the visa application form, going back 10 years, 15 years, maybe longer, I don't know. And I said to my staff one day, geez, we got to clean this stuff out. We have too much paper coming in. There's no place to put it. And they said, Mike, what do you want us to do? We have a couple hundred people a day to interview, process their paperwork, run their names through the computerized system to see if they're axe murderers or terrorists or bank robbers or something like this. And we can do one or the other, but not both. So I said, all right, forget the paperwork. We'll process the visas and just stack the documents up in the corner someplace.
That filing system or whatever they do with files, the destruction of documents is so weird how that works out. Like there's so much stuff, like even with the JFK stuff, they keep a lot of documents, but even then it's like, do you guys not know what digital is? Like we are transfer some of those onto like a digital drive so you could take up less space. But I mean, the government prints out a lot of documents, but I mean, I talked to Judge Thunheim from the AARB who was in charge of declassifying a lot of those JFK documents, and he said two reasons why they would keep a document for threats of national security. One is that the person who is involved in the document is still alive, and there might be too much information where they can't redact the name, or there's something active that they used back then that is still being active today. And that's what scares me when it comes to national security stuff, because much like, studying covert action capabilities of our government, there's a lot of stuff that goes on, whether it's wiretapping, whether it's a bunch of regime change, all these types of things that start going on. You start going, okay, well, what documents and what information is on those documents that you guys might still be using today? That's a dangerous thing, especially when you're involved in studying overseas stuff and you're kind of starting to understand more about the people there when you step outside of the US atmosphere or like the little bubble that we're in. You have more compassion. And I think everyone has that ability to, but it's just about looking for that information as well too. We necessarily aren't taught a lot of the other side of history on some things, and I think that really adds in perspective.
Yeah, they always claim sources and methods might be revealed, but they never specify what the sources and methods are, which is generally going out and talking to people, contracting with agents that the CIA's case officer finds are located in good positions and are willing to talk to someone from the American government. Whether or not they reveal their nature, I don't know. It depends, I guess, on the individual case. But by and large, it isn't any great secret. They have NSA, the National Security Agency, that has a very good uh, budget that enables it to listen to telephone conversations all the way around the world, to read faxes, to read emails, and so forth. And by and large, I can see redacting something if it's a person who might be directly and immediately harmed. But by and large, a lot of the reporting that comes out isn't that highly classified. I remember my last assignment at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at Maine State, where we would read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the wire services, API, UPI, and Reuters, plus restricted diplomatic reporting, things that were had limited distribution or were for the eyes of one particular person only, and some CIA reporting. And when they had the questionable coup in the then Soviet Union in 1991, I was reading what was coming out in the national news media, plus what was coming out in all of the classified reporting. And by and large, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two, with the exception maybe of names and sources. So either the news services were very, very good at their job, or the intelligence services really weren't. So it's you classify stuff to be safe so that you won't get burned, so you won't get a bad efficiency report, that kind of nonsense.
Now, when it comes to your Freedom of Information Act stuff, the stuff that they might be keeping for threat of national security, have you wondered why, like certain things that might fit the description of national security?
Well, I think what the reason they classified all this stuff and refused to give me any information whatsoever was basically I was looking at and threatened to lift the rug under which they'd swept a lot of this dirt about American Islamic terrorism and how it supported it, created it, funded it, and so forth. And they didn't want that out. I wrote to the people involved in Jeddah who wrote me bad efficiency reports. I wrote to the people in Stuttgart who wrote me bad efficiency reports. And I said, look, you wound up creating these terrorists And some of the terrorists went to New York City and the Pentagon and flew airplanes into those buildings. And in the case of World Trade Center 7 in New York, for some reason it collapsed without being hit by anything. Now, don't you feel bad about this? Weren't you directly involved in getting visas for these characters? Uh, Never got an answer back, really.
I'm surprised this isn't included in the 9/11 Commission report, the 535 pages. They don't talk anything about the visas. They don't talk anything. It's funny because my buddy's mother's boyfriend, he used to be a pilot, and he talked about like the one of the places the hijackers got their training from was a place in Florida, and him and his best friend happened to be teaching that instruction class. So he talked about he thought it was weird that the guy didn't want to learn how to land, and the guy goes, "No, you need to learn how to land." And that's just a weird like one off. I don't have a document that'll tell you like this guy was there at that day. I'm just saying that to me, like hearing that from someone that like he has no bragging rights to tell me that, whatever. I'm just like, but I haven't like dived into the whole 9/11 thing. But can you take me through before we even get into the history of Islamic terrorism, how we created it, how we supported it, how we did all of that? Your job at the visas department, could you take me into how you got even into that position, what exactly entailed to some of your things as well too, and when did you leave?
Well, when you join the State Department, what they really want to do is send you as a first tour officer out to deal with consular affairs. Uh, they basically have a lot of people getting burned out from that. They get a lot of people who are needed all the way around the world to interview people, and you just simply don't pass in an application and get a visa right away. Most cases, you require a personal appearance. Uh, and what I did was I simply interviewed these people. They would come in, we'd have 100, 200 a day, depending on whether or not it was a major holiday and people were leaving the country to go somewhere else where they could drink beer and dance with women or whatever. And I would basically get a line of people in the waiting room, and I'd be there behind my plexiglass bulletproof window, talking to them about their application. You know, why are you going to the United States? Do you have a letter from your company saying that you're going on a business trip? Who are you going to see in the United States? Are you going to go to the Grand Canyon? Are you going to Disneyland? And so forth. And they, by and large, they would talk themselves out of a visa by giving me peculiar answers. Or in one case, one guy, I asked him, I said, "Where are you going in the United States?" And we had a series of pictures around the waiting room of Detroit, and New York City, and Washington, and so on. He looks around, says, "Oh, I'm going to Detroit." And I said, "No, you're not."
That's a vacation hotspot, I heard.
I don't want to go to Detroit, period.
So did you have a guidelines, like certain things that would come off as red flags to you? Like, was it just like per interviewer basis, like your own feeling, your own judgment on these cases, or did you guys have a set kind of guidelines that were like, these are top 10 red flags that if any of these people cross any of these or any two of these, you say no to their visa?
Well, it's a little bit of both. They gave us some brief training in Washington, talking about some guy coming to the United States, and he's 87 years old. Who's going to marry a 20-year-old girl? As an example of, is this real? Um, and the Post also had not a lookout book, but a book based on visa fraud by nationality. Like the Sudanese all wanted to go to Boston for medical procedures, that kind of thing. But by and large, the Immigration and Nationality Act and the State Department's Foreign Affairs Manual, which tells you pretty much how to do everything, boil down to any person applying for a visa is an intending immigrant, and until he can prove otherwise, you refuse the visa. If you have any questions, you refuse the visa. And by and large, you ask them about what ties they have to their home country or place of application, since there are a lot of foreigners living in Saudi Arabia. And it can be everything from family to a job, to owning property, to managing a business. going to school, you're in your last semester of whatever, and you really have to come back after Christmas vacation to finish your degree, that kind of thing. So if they couldn't give me an indication of why they were going and what they were going to do there, like one guy I refused and was overruled on was a fellow taking a whole bunch of workmen to the United States, and he owned property there, and he was going to bring his cheap Saudi labor over there and pay them peanuts and have them work on his property, taking jobs from American citizens or permanent residents. And I said no, and I refused it. And then they had a guy who wanted to bring a driver with him, and the driver couldn't read. And I said, well, if he's driving you in the United States, he's got to be able to read the street signs, and you can't have the visa.
So did they, like, if you looked at the timeline before 9/11 and then you looked at compared to after, I mean, were they labeling certain countries? Were they targeting, like, putting on warning lists, like certain individuals that might need a more thorough background check? Like, what's the average time to get a visa application?
Yeah, they had uh, a visa lookout system computerized in Washington, and if you approved a visa, you sent the guy's name and address and age and any other identifying information through the computer to Washington, and it would kick back fairly quickly whether the guy was a terrorist, whether he was a wanted criminal, and so forth. Um, so by and large, it took me about 2 minutes after I'd been there a couple of months to decide whether or not I would give the guy a visa. And in fact, in many instances, I could look at the people standing in line and know who I was going to refuse by their way they were dressed, their passport, their appearance, and so forth. So we would tell them yes or no, and they would pay for their visa in many instances, depending on what the Foreign Affairs Manual said. If Americans were charged for a visa to go to country X, well, we had some guy from country X applying for a visa to go to the States. We'd charge him the equivalent in dollars or Saudi reals or whatever uh, uh, of what his country charged American citizens. And we'd run the stuff through the lookout system until they'll come back in the afternoon and they would get their passports with a visa stamped in it.
Now, when it comes to the creation of Islamic terrorism, what you just kind of told me a second ago, there's I don't know if this is conspiracy, but it's part of like the 9/11 stuff, which is that these people, like, even if you read the commission report on the 9/11 thing, they preface it with, this is hindsight. Like, we can't just, cherry pick everything that back then. This is what we know now. But they talked about TSA should have red flagged a bunch of stuff that these people had, but somehow, whether it was a lack of them doing their job or something like that. But I've heard the same thing with some people's applications as well, too, that they let some of these people go through. They were surveilling some of them. I don't know if that's conspiracy but I've seen like a decent amount of documentation that goes. I mean, I put a little bit of weight into it to say that a lot of people bring up the fact that we trained the people that ended up biting us in the ass, but they talked about they knew what these people, they had them being surveilled, and they let them to see what happens, like see what would happen. And that's eventually what happened. And obviously 9/11 happened. And I mean, is there a weight to that? Have you looked into that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there was people who were recruited specifically to come to the States, like the blind Sheikh Abdul Rahman. Um, he was on the terrorist list, yet he got a visa from a CIA case officer on the weekend, and supposedly nobody checked the lookout list for this guy. The computer wasn't running on the weekend, and the guy came in, and the guy looked at a microfilm list of the lookout list that you put into a reader and scroll through. But by and large, I think they knew who he was, and they deliberately gave him the visa. And the guy was in and out of the States a number of times, even though he was on a watch list. So it was a policy decision.
So are they lying? Like, are the government, the CIA, whoever is lying because of the fact I could be wrong on this, so correct me, but we were training them with this type of action of flying airplanes and this thing that happened because to use them against Russia. and it didn't go that way at all. We were training them. I think their official statement was defending or be able to defend their land or something like that. But really, it was just to make, Russia's life a little bit more hell. So that's not wrong.
Correct. It's not wrong. And the idea was to train these people in shooting things down and blowing things up, hopefully with Soviet soldiers inside in Afghanistan. And Graham Fuller, in fact, the CIA case officer involved in this, got the bright idea of sending these terrorists across the Amu Darya River into the Muslim republics of the old Soviet Union to blow things up and to create chaos. And that's really dangerous to me because the Russians have, or the Soviets, whatever you want to call them, then and now, they've got half the world's supply of atomic bombs. And you've got the United States running a proxy war in the Ukraine, along with its NATO so-called allies, against the Russian Federation, which is not at all smart. It's destroying the American economy. It's destroying the European economy. But you get this fantastically orchestrated propaganda. It's a descendant of Frank Wisner's Mighty Wurlitzer. He's a former CIA official who sees the propaganda machine that the CIA has control of as a great organ that plays its tune and drowns out everything else. For example, Operation Mockingbird, which was started in the 1940s, and from what I can see, is still continuing today.
Yeah, it didn't end. If you look it up on Google, they said it ended after like 3 months or something like that. But in the new 22 release of JFK documents, it says right in there, get your media assets in line. We got to stop the propaganda that there was conspiracy in the assassination. I'm like, this is in 64. I was like, they said it all ended in like 63. So I was like, hang on a second. Obviously, it's still going on.
Yeah, well, look at the Ukraine today. You've got the Ukrainians and Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Union, saying both the same thing. They've lost 100,000 soldiers and maybe 35,000 more missing. And there's something like 200,000 soldiers in the entire Ukrainian army. Uh, and yet the wife of Zelensky, the so-called president, who plays the piano with his penis on television, uh, she goes on a $40,000 shopping spree in Paris, and I don't think she bought pink pistols or hand grenades color-coded to her shoes. But this was reported and then slapped down, and people who made these statements in Newsweek, for example, were regarded as crackpots and conspiracy theorists, which is the CIA's term coined at the time of the Kennedy assassination, about anybody who questioned the official story, the official theory of what happened, which doesn't hold up upon any kind of examination.
Well, I mean, even if you look at like what the news was reporting about Ukraine before the war even started, they were talking trash on Zelensky and they were being very critical of him. They weren't, praising him, or they weren't saying our heart goes out to you. But then once this war started, the whole thing did a complete 180. And I go, does anybody think that's not weird? It's like they're preying off of how people have this empathy for another country. The media just sees that and they're like, go run it, run the script. And it's like we're all like not paying attention to the past couple of months. They were just talking trash. And that's like, I mean, I guess that's on us because obviously anything that pops up on the TV to try and capture a certain, topic that's trendy to them for whatever, if it's views or whatever. But it's all this suspiciousness. And it's like whenever you say the word like brainwashing, people roll their eyes and say conspiracy. I would say advertising's brainwashing, like just telling you to get a Coke, like capital, and it's like trying to explain this. And I'm curious, like, I mean, when it comes to the Ukraine stuff and when it comes to Russia, I mean, are you aware? Like, do you look at the news here? Or do you look at the news from another country's perspective? Because I feel like when sometimes you get that outside news from another country, they examine it a hell of a lot better and give you the straight details of what actually is going on than over here.
Yeah. No, I do. I look at the Washington Post, as I told a friend in London this morning, that I read it to find out what is not happening. But I do look at other news websites from other countries to get a better perspective on this. And you look at the paper and they say, oh, the evil Russians killed so many civilians in a rocket strike against a power plant. And at the same time, they never mentioned the 14,000 ethnic Russians in the eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, that were killed by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians never agreed to implement the Minsk Accords, which was organized by the French and the Germans to destabilize I can't say the word, not destabilize, but
Destabilization.
de-escalate
De-escalate.
the problem in the Donbass region, and to remove heavy weapons and grant the Donbass, which is Lugansk and Donetsk regions in the Ukraine, to give them more autonomy. And instead, the Ukrainians, through a series of governments, killed 14,000 of them. This doesn't come up.
Well, that's because they're trying to do the same thing they labeled with Islamic terrorism. They're trying to make Russia look like the overall big arching enemy. And that's, I mean, I wouldn't say, I think the top three superpowers are like China, the US, and then Russia as well, too. So, I mean, it's eliminating a competitor, just brainwashing. I mean, propaganda, much like we used during the, against the Nazis. I mean, Nazis weren't good. I'm not justifying them, but our propaganda was really strong because they didn't want us to be susceptible to any German tactics. And I mean, it's good from a government standpoint. It's pretty strategic, but also it really messes up society when you start doing that. I mean, if you ask anybody what's an Islamic terrorism, there's going to be a certain ethnicity that pops up into their mind, and it's not how it should be. It should be, we should be open to everybody, obviously, but we have this brainwashed condition now that when we're ever on a plane, and there's, I think, plenty of movies make jokes about this too, just because of certain ethnicities on a plane, you immediately, clutch your pearls or hold the purse or something. And it sucks because, I mean, you can't justify the actions of a few compared to labeling a whole race. And it's like, that's just trying to get the public saying that, that makes sense, but it's still like conditioned into them to like this. So even when it comes to labeling of terrorism, I mean, did you notice, like, especially after 9/11, I think the first couple of months, the whole country was wounded and people are still wounded, especially people that are affected. But what was interesting to me was the amount of marketing that started going on. People selling 9/11 t-shirts, that whole commercial aspect where I'm like, you start to see like profiting off of an event like this because they can. And it's like, I mean, we still do all these ceremonies and stuff like that. But whenever the family brings up disputes, and I had Ray McGinnis on the show talk about it, you find people don't call it a conspiracy when it's the families. They'll say like they're mourning. I'm like, well, the families are bringing up really interesting questions and ones that you should be questioning. But we just move on with it.
Yeah. Well, conspiracy is questioning the official story, is the way I see it. And people don't like that. There was never a real good investigation of September 11th. There was never an investigation at all of the Kennedy assassination. They gloss this over. They ignore it. They accept whatever the government tells them as fact. And 110-story buildings don't collapse into their own footprint, no matter what. If there's a slight breeze blowing, something that big will go sideways. And like the Kennedy assassination, the guy used a cheap, inaccurate rifle, shooting through trees when
he got a job there a month before the route was even published. And it's like, unless he had mind powers. But I mean, he even had 3 bullets on the ground, which they found, and then 1 bullet in the chamber. And I was like, everyone saw Kennedy's head explode, right? Why the hell are you reloading? And why would you go to a theater after it's all done? Like, it's just like, okay, all right, we don't have to get into that. But the 9/11 one, I mean, that's like the craziest thing is that I started noticing a lot of these controversial topics and stuff that we steer away from as societies because it's been labeled as conspiracy. I'm like, we're doing the same thing when we label another nation this. We do the same thing and it's not. It's just questioning a lot of things. And look, I said when we talked off air, I'm a patriot at heart. I get a lot of the stuff because other countries are doing the same type of intelligence operations and things of that sort. So we're not going to be the only ones that are doing it. But also the fact that there's no recognition from us about understanding, like the church committee was a whitewash, and that exposed a lot of dark stuff. But nobody paid a price. This idea that the government's incompetent because they get caught is a real big issue, because I think the public needs to be able to have the conversations about it, but somehow we've ingrained it into our head that it's useless information, or anybody that doesn't agree with the official story, or the government doesn't make a statement saying, oh yeah, we lied about that, then everything's just a rumor, or it's just conspiracy talk. And every other nation doesn't have these types of conspiracies. Everyone can talk about it relatively easy. Especially people in the UK are fascinated with the JFK subject, but 9/11, it's just like it's too emotional. You can't touch it, and I don't see the government really, doing anything but profiting off that emotion.
Exactly. And it's a shame because it's 3,000 odd people died, and they used it as a pretext to start the forever war against Arabs and Muslims. And all this has done is kill an awful lot of people, waste a lot of money that could be put to better use. I mean, look at all the homeless people in the United States. Look at water pipes that burst in the wintertime because they weren't buried below the frost line, and how they never bothered to check to see if the pipe was rusting away and needed to be replaced. I mean, simple maintenance is not done anymore anywhere.
Now, when
Uh,
we talk about certain kind of conditioning and labeling against Islamic terrorism, what kind of propaganda tactics are we talking about here? Because like I looked into the government influencing like Hollywood and media and all that. It's still common today too, in very, very small ways. Like I think even Jurassic Park 3 at the ending, the government was like, "We want you to add this into your script," and they did. It's right at the ending. It says, "Thank God for the Marines." Just that little simple thing, but also, like, I mean, it's been the comedy joke now about, like I just mentioned to you before, about seeing a certain thing and clutching your pearls. That's stereotypicalized in there, and there's even more critical aspects of Islam. And I just think because it doesn't agree with the Christian values, and that's like a large jump, but that's mostly what America's been built off of, is this Christian and Catholic idea, and everything else is like labeling it communism. We can't have it here. And I think, once people kind of start seeing the lineup and the connections, I'm just interested into like some of the things that kind of awoken you to this labeling of Islamic terrorism.
well, a lot of things. Going to Saudi Arabia, for example, I never met an Arab in my life, or at least I didn't know if I did. I mean, Arabs don't have Arab tattooed on their forehead, or I am a Muslim on their forehead. Um, but I began to meet Arabs and Muslims in Saudi Arabia, and then I came back here to DC and went to law school and had some Arab clients. Joined a couple of Arab organizations, and could see that these people aren't demons. They don't have horns and a tail. They're like everybody else. They have a value system that is pretty much close to the Christian idea. I mean, you look at the I don't know whether it's the second or the third surah of the Holy Quran, which lists all the things you have to do to be a good Muslim, and by and large, it's um, a rewording maybe of the Ten Commandments. Um, Jack Shaheen, who's dead now, wrote a book called Real, Reel, Bad Arabs, where he goes into detail about um, TV shows and movies that always make fun of the Arabs. And I remember being struck. I guess I've been more sensitized since I've been writing about them, been dealing with them, been to parties at their houses and things like that. Um, I watched Roman Holiday, the movie that made Audrey Hepburn a star. And at the end of the picture, she's giving interviews to all sorts of journalists. And it's somebody from the New York Times and somebody from Detroit Free Press or something. And then they have a fellow from the Israel Times in Tel Aviv. But there's nobody from any of the Egyptian newspapers or any of the other newspapers that are extant in the Arab world. So I said, well, wait a minute. This is exactly how you push the Arabs and Muslims off to one side. They're not people. They don't exist. They don't have newspapers. They don't have correspondence. But Israel does. So this is how you do this. It's a very subtle form of discrimination.
Well, there's even a weird thing with the Kennedy assassination. It's the first time out of like 90 something experts I've talked to where he said it was a plot from Israel. And it was like, what? It's like, is there still like I'm Ashkenazi, so I'm like, I hope it's not, Israel that's orchestrating the plot. But he was so brainwashed, or I wouldn't say brainwashed, but he was so sure of himself that it was 100% this Palestinian corruption and it's all this influence, and it got really like, whoa. And I mean, a lot of that does come from a factor of like there are stereotypes out there about, certain ethnicities, Jewish people involved in Hollywood and these types of things. And I don't know if it's what they've seen document wise, or maybe it's just a couple of extremists that ended up labeling something as a document as this. Even a mix up in some of the autopsy report, our last guy's last name was Israel. And throughout the rest of some documents, they called it Israel autopsy report. And it was like, somebody's going to take that the wrong way. And this guy did. But I mean, that's, if you look back in history, I'm sure you know this from looking at covert action, a lot of stuff the government does. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say right wing extremists, I would just say purists or extremists in the sense of whatever their ideology is. Hoover was one of those guys. I wouldn't label Hoover as right wing, but I would list him as a person that gained way too much power and it took over him. And I think that's with a lot of these like these anti this or anti that, or these labeling. I think even with the media today, what does the media report on when it's something from another country? It's either a bad interaction that's going on, or something that happened to us, or something that conditions the people to think that, oh my God, these people are hostile. We need to do something about them before they come over here and do this to us. And we've never had an attack over here. Besides 9/11, we haven't had a war on our shores. And people have this somehow deep inside fear, even though we're not connected to something like that.
Well, they've got to keep the fear alive. You can't justify the $850 billion that Joe Biden is spending on the War Department, and whatever the amount of money that goes to the intelligence services that nobody will admit to, even though the Constitution requires a report of expenditures by government agency. Uh, who do we have to fear? I mean, if we weren't antagonizing the Russians and the Chinese, we wouldn't have to fear anybody. I don't think the Vatican's going to attack us. I don't think that Belize is going to blow up Washington, D.C. So I think that as long as the fear is there, you can do anything you want and justify anything you want, unfortunately.
How do you, I mean, through like my research into the JFK stuff, I kind of started knowing a little bit more about this. I think we're kind of on the same level a little bit. You probably way more experience in a lot of the government stuff, but when it comes to the path that you've been on and kind of looking into a lot of the covert action, the regime change, like I've done my hardest to study like MK Ultra, read all the government documents on that, church committee, all of that. This is still left out of the public's consciousness. It's still labeled as a conspiracy, and it's hard to get people on the level that, yes, it's not only us, it's other countries as well too, but we also need to recognize the evil here as well. I'm curious, you spent a lot of times overseas and you got to know a lot of these people. Did they have the same reaction to you when you went over there, maybe to your initial reaction to going over there in the first place?
How do you mean the same reaction?
Like when you went over there, were they looking at you like some type of demon, like how, sometimes people over here tend to look at someone from over there coming over here?
No, no. Saudi Arabia, I met with all kinds of people from all over the place. I mean, we had various Arabs from different countries. We had people from Africa. Um, by and large, the ones I met with, I had no problem with. I didn't get the impression they saw me as a mass murderer or a demon or anything like that. I was in Germany for a total of 5 years on two separate occasions, and never had that feeling. They once they got to know you, they could talk freely to you. India, um, I don't think I got anything like that in India at all during the 2 years I was there.
I'm wondering if they're conditioned to not like us as well too, because the only thing I can only really think of is, besides like the 9/11 scenario of them biting us in the ass because we trained them and they did that. The only thing I can think of is the fact that if you demonize that, Saudi Arabia, whoever you want to demonize, it covers up the eyes that would be looking into the business relationships that you have developed with these countries that nobody else is aware of. And I hate to say it like that because I can get labeled conspiratorial, but I mean, that's the only thing. I'm sure there's various other reasons, but that starts to make a lot more sense to me of like you start realizing, wait, George Bush was doing deal what? Wait, I thought we were not supposed to like these people. And you kind of start digging a little deeper and start going through and you go, wait, so do we have a business relationship with these people? And then you start going, why are you telling me to hate them then? And it's like, oh, well, they don't want you understanding all these weird connections. And it's the idea of intelligence agencies protecting their reputation. And not just the intelligence agencies, but the idea of America, the idea of government. And that's like, I know that's very critical. And a lot of patriots probably that would be listening to this will probably tell me, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. But there is a large amount of like the government trying to keep its reputation. Threats to national security are things that make the agency look bad or the government look bad. And they did instill us with this idea of spreading democracy, whatever the hell that means.
Mm. Well, it depends, I guess, on the country and what it's getting from the Americans. If you're a country that gets money from the United States in foreign aid or um, preferential sale of weapons or something like this, then by and large, the polls that I've seen and are in fact in the book Visas for Al Qaeda, they love America. But on the other hand, if you're from Lebanon or if you're from Iraq or someplace like this, no, we don't have a good opinion of the United States. And I don't know whether they make a distinction between the government or the people that make up the government or control the government, supposedly. I don't know. But by and large, L. Fletcher Prouty, in his book JFK, what is it? JFK, Vietnam, and the assassination of John Kennedy. He makes a point in the book of what the United States does. It wants preferential treatment and for its exports, and it works with countries to overthrow governments we don't like and are not helpful to us. And then we'll install a new government, and they get preferential treatment in running businesses to import American goods.
People with close ties to our own ideologies. It's the whole point with Castro as well, too. Castro was kicking everybody out, and even the mob got a piece of the action on trying to assassinate him. 634 attempts. It did not work, by the way. That's nuts. But that's it. If you look from a business aspect, which is what the government views it by, which makes it so hard for me to understand when I see a person from whoever say like, oh, we care about you and we're doing this because it's the best decision for everyone back home, the civilians. I go, I don't believe that. There's something, it's this idea of what's going to be more profitable. And I hate to say it like that because it sounds really dark, but I mean, it's regime change strategies. I mean, getting a whole country to literally turn in on itself. It's the same thing that other countries do to us over here. And we're pretty good at being susceptible to, Russian troll farms and the whole list goes on and on. But when you start looking at, I hate to say false flag operations, but when you go into, do you think that, would you put it above the government to not find someone from Saudi Arabia or someone of that characteristic or personality, do whatever and make them do something that would seem and then get publicized all over the news to make us fear even more? Like, I hate to say it like that, and that does sound conspiratorial, but I think, there's, once you learn about through all the documents about all the stuff that they do, that the general public probably doesn't know about, you start going, okay, I do not put that above our government to do something just to instill the fear and make sure that we're really conditioned still.
No, exactly right. You get a patsy, you get someone who wants to make a profit, you get somebody who might have an ideology favoring this, and yeah, you can get a false flag. They're talking now about false flag nuclear explosions in the Ukraine, that the Americans and the Ukrainians will work together to do a dirty bomb that doesn't really devastate half of Europe, but puts out a lot of deadly radiation, or a small tactical nuclear device that would only wipe out, something 100 miles in radius from where it's set off. And that will be really dangerous because the Russian President Putin has repeatedly stated that we will not use nuclear weapons unless and until weapons of mass destruction are used against us, or the political and territorial integrity and the existence of the Russian Federation is put at risk by enemies. But the Americans, however, have given control of nuclear weapons in Europe to local commanders. So you don't need the man in Washington with his finger on the button to take care of this. You can get somebody over there that would handle the matter for him.
Now, do you get a lot of public reception, like a lot when you sell one of your books? Is the public generally interested in a lot of this? Like, I know it's a conspiratorial, it can get labeled a conspiratorial subject, which sparks an interest in a certain community for sure. But I find that like when you start explaining, like much like you're doing, certain things and certain connections, and it's really just critical thinking. It's not even a conspiracy, but the public kind of starts to listen in a little bit and really start to kind of like either do their own research, which I try my best to make sure people know if they listen to my show and they hear something, go do your own research as well too. Sort out your opinions for yourself. You're going to decide whether you come across something and go a certain way, but you get good public reception, or I'm sure you probably get some critics that are just patriots down to the bone of like government does no wrong.
Well, it's a little bit of both, I guess, and it's kind of interesting in that it sells very well amongst the 9/11 truth people. A German publishing house, in fact, gave me 4,000 euros for the German rights to the book, and they translated it and it sold it over there. Um, but by and large, it's been ignored publicly here in the United States. I've talked it up in various places. I've spoken. Um, Went to the University of Hartford, Connecticut one time and talked about my books. Been other places doing the same thing, and people are very receptive. But in one case, a woman I knew who was a member of the Women's National Democratic Club here in Washington, D.C., and they were looking for speakers for their noontime program, and she suggested me and one of my books, and they were very much interested in it. She'd given them a copy of of both books, I think. And all of a sudden, some young girl in her first job there took the viewpoint that, oh, this is a conspiracy theorist. It's not written up in the New York Times. It's not reviewed in the Washington Post. Well, neither of those organizations will touch me with a 10-foot pole or a 12-foot Hungarian because I'm criticizing their very existence. The organizations that they support, the Washington Post, is in the pocket of the American government. So they simply disinvited me based on this girl's comments.
That's the same. Before Alec Baldwin had his giant scandal, he was doing something on the Kennedy assassination. He had a program with a bunch of researchers, and then like last minute or something, the whole program got canceled. He ended up not doing the JFK section part of the show, and this was like in 2012. I had like Larry Schnapp on here, who's part of that lawsuit against Biden. But to me, it was like, what the like. I don't get it at this point. It's like it's such an old topic. It's like even Tucker Carlson saying whatever he said, whether you agree with his view or not, it's the first time in 60 years a reporter has had any courage to do that. The issue with that is it's going to get labeled a right-wing conspiracy because Carlson does play on some of that stuff as well too. And then, or it gets, I don't know, out of the public's reception in a matter of like less than a week, it was gone. Now nobody's not talking about it anymore.
You mean the Kennedy assassination?
Well, just I mean, any conspiratorial, yeah. Well, with Tucker Carlson, the Kennedy assassination, but any conspiratorial topics, anything, even 9/11. If you look at the 9/11 programs, there's nobody on there that's from like the truther community, and there's reasonable people in the truther community. Just one answer is like, why was the scrap sold like less than like a couple days after when the family was like, hey, let's investigate this? So like, no, we got to give it to China real quick. Like there's reasonable questions that a lot of people just don't know about unless they dive into the subject. And then that is the biggest issue because when you dive into it, you break, like your mind just melts because there's so much that just gets thrown at you. Like there's this, and then you start thinking everything is a lie. And it's like, hang on a second, you got to take it in bits and pieces. There's none of that when 9/11 rolls around. And I think a lot of people, I would think curiosity sparked up in the smallest bit when they threatened Biden saying, don't come here. If you're not going to do what we want you to with the files and all that, then don't come here. And there became an issue. I don't know if he showed up or not, but when the families say something and there's news reporting on that, they just prey on the fact that these people are just going through some turbulent times and they're stressed out because it was so impactful. It's like, well, no, they have good questions. And I think their questions deserve answers after all this time.
Yeah, well, exactly. And you look at the Washington Post today, for example, they have the lead column is on how the Ukrainians, the Nazis really, are making great gains and then beating the pants off the Russian Federation. And then you have a section on an article on page after page of problems with bodybuilding for men and women and how it affects them physically. Where's the real news? Does anybody? The Washington Post has 1,000 journalists on staff, and all you get is dreck in the news. You see almost nothing there.
Well, it leads up the room to independent journalism, sadly. And a lot of those people don't have the platform that these news networks have. As much as we can say a lot of people don't watch the news, they still control a prime time spot. And at least the public's viewing conscious, whether you're going to check the weather and you hear a story. My issue is when is there ever going to be this code that's lifted from a lot of these news networks? I feel like with enough attention on like projects like Operation Mockingbird, bringing people to real events, real evidence, real scenarios that did happen, and showing them it's still happening in the kind of the same format, just a different time. I feel like a lot of that would just get enough people to, try and change this and have the news actually start. That's why I think even Tucker Carlson says something about the Kennedy assassination is a lot of people are aware that the news is kind of crap. But journalism, I mean, it hinders us as whoever's a journalist, whoever's going to go out there and do a story. It's like they get a good scoop, they drop it on the desk, report this is going to blow the minds off people. And then like, we can't do that because it's actually, we have a relationship with this person, and this person. So we're going to put this down, and we got a little segment on a squirrel riding a jet ski that we want you to do. And you're just like, what?
Well, Bob Perry covered that in a couple of his books, and Bob Perry's unfortunately dead now, but he broke part of the Iran-Contra story years ago. And he said that he was at Newsweek when he had a job there, and they were talking about an article, and he was pushing the article because it was an expose of something or other. I don't remember what now. But the people with control over what gets printed in the magazine said, "Oh, we can't do that, and we can't." And Perry said, "Well, why not?" "Well, we have advertisers. We don't want to offend them. This will not look good to Raytheon or Boeing. And besides, we're quoting government officials in this article, and it makes them look bad. And we need to have access to our contacts in government. And if we criticize anybody, they're going to dry up." And he just threw up his hands figuratively, I guess, and then put it into writing and in one of his books. In fact, a couple of his books. But that's the whole issue. The news media doesn't want to look at hard things because it might offend somebody and take away from the money coming into the bottom line or their contacts with the government. But newspapers and media, I guess you want to call it that, they're cutting back their news staff all over the country, whether it's from big operations like the New York Times and the Washington Post, or whether it's some small local newspaper that covers what's going on in school boards in Loudoun County or a suburb of Washington, D.C., or something happening in a newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland, that's existed for a good long while. I mean, they're cutting back staff, and there's nobody to go out there and talk to people. They're reduced to what they can find on the internet, I guess, and write about that. And you need to have somebody go out and talk face to face and tell them, look, this is on deep background. I'm not going to use your name. Nobody's going to figure what the source was or where it came from. I'm not going to use any identifying material that would cover the situation, so they could say, well, this had to come from this paper there, and there's only one journalist in that paper that writes on this subject. But no, they're losing the ability to do their job more and more, and you're dependent on these national news organizations for what they want you to know and nothing else.
Well, the only way they can talk about it is if they label it either a Democratic issue or a Republican's issue. devolved it into political sides where anytime I see somebody mention something, it has to be blamed onto the other news network or it has to be blamed onto the other political parties. The only way we can rationally talk about conspiracies on an open news network platform. I guarantee you, instead of saying the CIA helped slide some of these people's visas through because they had an incentive to do so, if you said that like these people trick security and they used the MK Ultra injection into their neck and all that, that would get played because there's no fault on the government. There is only a somehow increasing the fear even more, which is the fear culture that we live in. And I know that sounds like a ridiculous example, but trust me, as long as it doesn't incriminate the RUS government, then it'll be more than happy to get published. And I think, that's what kind of scares me a little bit. But when are we going to be able to have some type of organization, an antitrust organization that owns a network that's able to also override Freedom of Information Act requests? Now, I've talked to people involved in those offices, but maybe to get your Freedom of Information stuff to you faster, whether if the documents are destroyed and they can just give you a more clear-cut answer on some things. But there's a lot of like, we cannot confirm or deny. And you get that in a letter. It's like, I waited 7 years for you to tell me you couldn't confirm or deny. And I get the offices. I know some of the people in there, they go through a lot. But at the same time, it's like there's got to be an override process that puts a lot of these at the top of the charts, especially something that are big national historical events where you should be getting the answers at least to give you some insight and give you, I mean, even if you make a book, there's plenty of other books out there like we've talked about. Is the public going to be aware of every single book that's out there? No, but at least you can do your part and get the justice that you deserve on just an aspect of being able to add something into a book that other people can promote the more conversations that you do.
I recently read a book, and I gotta tell you, I don't know whether it's early Alzheimer's or what, but I can't remember the name of the book or the guy who wrote it. But it dealt with him trying to get information on American use of biological and chemical warfare going back to the Second World War in Korea. And it involved things like in Korea, he had read somewhere that um, the Americans were putting mold spores and anthrax and I don't know, things that would be deadly to wheat crops and things like this on feathers and would drop them out of airplanes over North Korea. And he wanted clarification, and he would write a Freedom of Information Act request. And a year later, he'd get a piece of paper that was mostly blacked out with redactions. And he would write about this and then write about taking his dog for a walk and having coffee or something. And then he'd go out and try again and again and again, and he'd get a little bit here and a little bit there. And by the end of the book, he really hadn't gotten what he wanted, but he got a really dark picture of what had been done and what they could have done, and he wasn't sure that they were still doing it.
There's I can put a lot of weight into that because if you know who Julian West is, if you just Google his name, he's the MK Ultra doctor that saw Jack Ruby. His initial job for the CIA was using Korean war veterans or victims, and unbrainwashing them because they had been brainwashed that we use biological weapons over there. So he would make them, forget that we did. And there's plenty of evidence to support now that we did use biological weapons over there, but that breaks the Geneva Convention rules. So with that, that makes us look bad if we use biological weapons. And that's a whole national security issue in its own, not even in this country, but to everyone else. It's like, wait, they're still using them? I thought we had a treaty. I mean, there's plenty of weight, and that's listed right on his Google. That's right on his little Wikipedia thing. So I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think there's a the dark stuff we do to cover up some things, man. And trust me, I get it. Like I understand other countries are doing stuff too, but dude, the amount of lying, it's like, oh my God, you have people that are having existential crisis on a daily basis. No wonder we got people throwing paint on freaking paintings because they're just mad at like climate and all that. And good, okay, but there's like way better ways to react and be able to get some processes going as well too. But we don't know where to start. There's so much.
Exactly. And it is remarkably frustrating. You got this COVID-19 nonsense where you create a bioweapon and then another bioweapon, the Frankenshots, that supposedly cure it or prevent
All right, careful,
getting
careful.
you.
YouTube will take that down. I can't talk about that. That's the issue too. There's guidelines, and trust me, we could do a whole nother episode on that topic in general. I've had Peter McCullough on and all those characters on, but I I did the research on it. I talked to one vaccine lawyer that was pro it and the other vaccine lawyer that was representing people that had adverse reactions. And they updated on the YouTube conditions, which I just tell people it's like a double standard. They updated the YouTube conditions on it to where they realized that banning anyone that has a reaction was now hindering their story being told to help get support for maybe some GoFundMe or something like that. So they updated the guidelines to say you can only talk about the effects if it's happening to you personally. And it was like, well, hold on a second. You just banned a whole thing for months. And then you updated that. And it's like, if you tell people like FBI assassinated Martin Luther King, the public will be like, I believe it. I believe it. But then you take it to like JFK or something like that. They go, no, no, no. I go, there's no double standard. You only largely accept the MLK thing because society is well known on the fact that a certain ethnicity was treated unfairly. It's the same thing with reporting. If you blamed it all on Al Qaeda or something like that, go ahead and report it. But if you say it's our agency, nah, there's no double standards like that. It doesn't happen like that.
No, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm just hoping, obviously I'm going to give you a second to promote your book as well too. And I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on your show, but I'm hoping that, more people can come across your work as well too. And we can get you on a platform. My show's all right. It's not Tucker Carlson or obviously someone that has like, a certain amount of viewership, but I think, it's important that you guys be able to speak your message as well too. At least, I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? People either turn the channel or people buy in and they listen and they start doing their own research and find out maybe a little bit of truth.
Yeah.
So is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Sure, they can go to Amazon, and this is the Visas for Al Qaeda book. I guess it's visible up on the screen.
It's a good cover.
And you can buy it as a paperback, or you can buy it as an ebook. And the website for the book is www.michaelspringman.com. And it has a review of the book by people who've read it. It mentions the other book, Visa, Goodbye Europe, Hello Chaos, Merkel's Migrant Bomb, with reviews on that as well. And that's also in ebook format. Visas for Al Qaeda was translated into German, and the book on the migrants is in English, German, and Spanish.
And I'm going to link all your links in the description so people can be able to check the YouTube details and be able to find it and go to your website and see your books as well too. And I'll link the Amazon stuff as well.
Good. Thank you very much.
Michael, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.